Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you out this evening, whether you're visiting with us or remember, we're thankful that you're here with us. We're going to have our class here in the auditorium in just a few minutes, but before that, we're going to sing number 499, Oh to Be Like Thee. We'll sing the first and last verses of this song, and Randall will teach us out here.
Oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, this is my constant longing and prayer. Gladly I'll forfeit all of those treasures, Jesus I bear, and likeness to wear. Oh, to be like thee, oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, pure as thou art. How in thy sweetness, how in thy fullness, set thine own image deep on my heart. Oh, to be like thee, Lord, I am longing now to receive thy anointing divine. All that I am bringing, Lord, from this moment, all shall be done. Oh, to be like thee, oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, pure as thou art. Come in thy sweetness, come in thy fullness, stamp thine own image deep on my heart.
Well, good evening. I want to welcome you here. I'm glad you're here. This is the last class of this series, and last week in this class, Chris covered quite a bit of ground, including the destruction of Jerusalem, the return of the exiles, and the intertestamental period. And tonight, as we close out this series on Egypt and the Bible, we'll primarily focus on biblical references to Egypt in the New Testament. But before going to the New Testament passages, I want to take just a little bit of time and look at the historical events that took place in Egypt in the first few centuries after Christ. And I think this will help us understand the significant influence Christianity had in Egypt after Christ ascended to heaven and Christians started evangelizing the world. So in the first century, well, even before that, in 31 BC, Octavian, who changed his name to Caesar Augustus when he became emperor of the Roman Empire, he defeated Egypt's rulers, Antony and Cleopatra, in a sea battle in northwestern Greece. In 30 BC, Octavian annexed Egypt as a Roman province, following the suicides of Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra, she was only 39 years old when she committed suicide. But there didn't seem to be, at least in their eyes, much of a choice because after their defeat, death was coming to them. All right, so we'll click on and let's see. There we go. In the first century AD, Alexandria, Egypt became the center of Greek culture on the Mediterranean, and it was the connecting point of Roman trade routes to the deserts, inner Africa and the east. Africa and Egypt and some of those desert countries produced goods that were desirable in Rome and in the Greek world, and most of those came through Alexandria, Egypt. the Egyptian gods Serapis and Isis became quite popular throughout the Roman Empire. So being polytheistic, two more gods would seem to be desirable to the Romans and to those in the Greek culture at the time. And within Egypt, the Roman emperors portrayed themselves as the successors to the pharaohs and continued to build temples in the Egyptian style. So the Roman emperors just tried to convince the Egyptians, hey, we're the new pharaohs in town. Just think of us that way. And also Christianity arrived in Egypt, and it was flourishing in the large Jewish community in Alexandria and other parts of Egypt. Some Christian groups, and I say that loosely because, and this is after the first century for the most part, some Christian groups claim that the gospel writer Mark was the first bishop of Alexandria and is said to have been martyred there in 66 AD. Well, that could be partially true or not true at all, but it is certainly not completely true, as Mark would have never served as a bishop as they describe it. In the mid-2nd century up to the 5th century AD, Alexandria developed into one of the leading intellectual centers of the Christian church. Alexandria, Egypt, was home to great Christian scholars and teachers, including Clement, who died in 215 AD, and Origen, who died in 253 AD. But at the same time, it also attracted several false teachers and scholars who were adherents to Gnosticism and other errant beliefs. In the 3rd century, Egypt's wealth became increasingly concentrated in the larger cities, including Alexandria. Probably much of the same way as here in our country, where maybe the farms and big farms had quite a bit of wealth at one time, but eventually that wealth made its way to the large cities, and Alexandria would have been one of them. And these large cities generally adopted the cultural lifestyles of Rome, and then also Coptic was a new written form of the Egyptian language, and it aided in the spread of Christian literature throughout the world. In the 4th century, Arius of Alexandria preached that Christ is divine, but not as divine as the Father. His philosophy, known as Arianism, spreads widely around the world. In 392 AD, the Egyptian temples are closed by order of the Byzantine emperor. In the 5th century, in Egypt, artworks of all kinds, stone and wood sculpture, carved ivories, painted glass, ceramics, and textiles are decorated with pagan and Christian themes. They blended the two. They mixed Christianity with pagan things. And the religious diversity that existed in Egypt at that time reflected the cultural diversity of the era. Not too unlike today. I'm okay with you, you be okay with me, we want to be inclusive, and in the church, you accept for what I believe, you can believe what you want to, we're all going to the same place type of thing. So, okay. In 451 AD, the Egyptian church rejected the Council of Chalcedon and distanced itself from the authority of Rome and Constantinople. Already the Roman Catholic Church was starting to divide, and there was the Eastern Orthodox Church that made its headquarters in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. And so there was already a split, and they both had their own popes, their own set of bishops and things like that, and Egypt was sort of there waffling between the two. But at this council in 451 AD, they decided that that's enough of that, and it laid the foundation for what is today called the Coptic Church. And you may have heard of the Coptic Church. I think there may be one, or was one here in Murfreesboro. And
Randall and the former Bellwood Church of Christ building.
that's what I thought. That's what I thought, at the former Bellwood Church.
It's very well attended.
Oh, it is? Mm-hmm. Yes. If you get the opportunity to go to Egypt next year with us, we probably will see some Coptic churches there when we visit Cairo. The Council of Chalcedon covered a broad range of topics, but one of the more contentious topics dealt with the notion that Jesus was fully divine, but never truly became human. And I can see where that could upset people, and I'll give credit to the Egyptians for saying, oh, we don't want anything to do with that mess. They probably had other messes, but that was one mess they didn't want to have to deal with. So, well, there you go. That's so much for Egyptian history. And now we're going to take a look at the Bible and see what it tells us about Egypt in the days of Jesus and his apostles. So what is the first mention of Egypt in the New Testament?
Genesis,
In the New Testament?
New Testament. Matthew,
Matthew. What happens in Matthew?
they went down. Christ and his parents went to Egypt to escape the Jewish authorities.
That's exactly right. And so Joseph did take Mary and Jesus to Egypt to escape the debt of threat by Herod the Great. So let's read Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. An angel of the Lord had told Joseph in a dream to flee to Egypt. Can you think of another Bible character who had dreams and was forced to go to Egypt?
Joseph,
Yes, the namesake, Joseph of the Old Testament. He too had dreams and was sold into slavery in Egypt. So we know that Herod was on a mission to kill baby Jesus. But what would fleeing to Egypt do for Joseph and his family? What benefit did that have for them? Well, the Egyptian border was about 75 miles from Bethlehem, which doesn't seem too far. It would have been another 125 miles to get to the Nile River and Delta region. This would put some separation between Herod and Jesus, and we may don't know where Joseph and his family went in Egypt, but that's some of the distances there. But the important thing is Herod's jurisdiction did not go beyond Palestine. It stopped at the river of Egypt, which is roughly the same border between Israel and Egypt today. And so once they crossed the border there, they were safe from Herod. Herod couldn't reach over and bring Joseph and his family back in. Egypt was a Roman province with a large Jewish population. Philo, who was is it Philo or Philo? Philo works for me. I only say it one time, so that's good enough. Who was a Jewish historian living in Alexandria, Egypt, early in the first century, estimated that there were more than 1 million Jews living in Egypt at that time. There was also a large number of synagogues in Egypt. Remember, this was long before there were Muslim mosques. There would have been Egyptian temples and possibly Roman temples down there, Roman gods anyway. And then there were Jewish synagogues. This was generally a peaceful time for Jews and Egyptians to live together at that time. And there was no animosity between the two. And as far as the Bible tells us, this is the only time Jesus ever traveled outside of Palestine. By going to Egypt, Jesus was outside of the reach of Herod. Further in Joseph's dream, the angel of the Lord instructed him to stay in Egypt until he told it was safe to return. And Joseph, as we see, wasted no time in following the angel's directions. Joseph, with Mary and Jesus in tow, left that night to start their journey to Egypt. I imagine they were in a hurry to get out of there before Herod and his soldiers came in. It wouldn't have been for the purpose like I did on occasion when my girls were little. I'd start traveling at night hoping that they would sleep most of the way. And that probably was not so much the point with Joseph there. They remained in Egypt until Herod dies, which happened in March or April in the year 4 BC. We don't know how long Joseph and his family stayed in Egypt. It could have been as little as 2 months, or it could have been several months. But with such a large Jewish community living in Egypt, it would have been relatively easy to blend in and survive in a foreign land. You know, I think for a lot of us, if we were to cross a border into another country, it could be difficult. Canada maybe not so much, but many other countries, particularly if you don't speak the language, but it was not difficult going into Egypt with so many Jews already living there. One must also consider that Joseph was skilled as a carpenter, and he could have been gainfully employed during their stay. And what had they been given before they left Bethlehem?
The wise men gave them treasures.
Yeah, they had the gold, the frankincense, the myrrh, the valuable gifts that they had given. This could have brought them enough income to sustain them for a while. Maybe it was God's providence that they had those gifts and they had the resources available to survive in Egypt while they were down there. So if you're wondering about the saying of the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son, that came from the prophet Hosea. Hosea had applied the saying to the Hebrews coming out of Egypt under Moses. Here Matthew applies it to Jesus. In another comparison, Herod could be likened to Pharaoh. Just as Pharaoh sought to kill the Hebrew baby boys in Moses' day, Herod also sought to kill the Jewish baby boys living in and around Jerusalem and Bethlehem in Jesus' day. In Matthew, let's see, do I have this on it? Yeah, I do. Okay, yes. I think I got I don't think it's 13, I think it's 19 and 20, but anyway, in Matthew 2, 19 and 20, we read of the return of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus from Egypt. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. Again, it was an angel of the Lord who appeared to Joseph in a dream, telling him he could return. They were finally safe. This, too, reminds us of God telling Moses it was safe to return to Egypt because the ones who sought his life were dead. In Acts 2:10, and I don't have a slide for this because it's just a little short verse. In Acts 2:10, on the day of Pentecost, when the church began, many people from all over the world gathered to hear Peter and the other apostles proclaim the good news of Jesus. Luke writes in verse 10 that listeners from Egypt were present that day. Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome. All these listeners would have been Jewish because the gospel had not been given to the Gentiles yet. However, they were still citizens or residents of the land from where they came. So it is likely that residents from a country who once enslaved the Old Testament people of God were added to the church, God's New Testament people of God. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen tells the history of the Jews from Abraham to Jesus. And in Acts chapter 7 is a wonderful chapter. If you ever want to read a brief, concise history of the Jews, which is very thorough and concise, I recommend going to Acts chapter 7. Stephen's defense of the gospel to the Jewish leaders is just outstanding in this chapter. But he was given this defense of the gospel to the Jewish leaders who were out to get blood. Specifically, they were out to get Stephen's blood. It is one of the most thorough accounts of Jewish history that you can find. And while preparing for this class, I learned something from this passage of Scripture I had never realized before, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Let's look at Acts chapter 7, verses 9 through 16. And the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt. But God was with him and rescued him out of all his afflictions and gave him favor and wisdom before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who made him ruler over Egypt and over all his household. Now there came a famine throughout Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction, and our fathers could find no food. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers on their first visit. And on the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh. And Joseph sent and summoned Jacob his father and all his kindred, 75 persons in all. And Jacob went down into Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers. And they were carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of silver from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. Throughout Jewish history, God had always sent deliverers, whether it be Moses, Joshua, or one of the prophets or judges. The Jews rejected them all, but Joseph may have been the first deliverer to be rejected. It was their Jewish fathers, the sons of Jacob, Joseph's brothers, who rejected him. Stephen goes on to tell the familiar story of Joseph being sold into slavery, how he rose to become a leader in Egypt, how he rescued his family and all of Egypt with his plan to store grain for an upcoming famine, and how he welcomed his brothers and his father Jacob to Egypt. Stephen speaks of how Jacob and his sons all died in Egypt. A few weeks ago, we mentioned at the end of a class that Jacob was buried in Hebron, where his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham were buried. It's a place I really wanted to go to, but I just don't think we're going to make it down there, Paul. The bones of Joseph were brought out of Egypt when the Hebrews left captivity and were returned to the land of Canaan. Joseph was buried in Shechem, a piece of land that Abraham had bought some 2,000 years earlier. This we can know from reading Joshua 24:32. In Joshua, it only mentions the bones of Joseph being buried in Shechem. But in verses 15 and 16, it says, And Jacob went down to Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers, and they were carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham had bought. This leads me to believe that not only were Joseph's bones brought back, but the bones of all 12 sons of Jacob were brought back. I had never realized this, because Joshua only mentions Joseph's bones, but Stephen seems to allude to the fact that all the bones of their fathers were brought back, all the fathers, and were buried in Shechem. So where were they buried? In Shechem, of course. Where was Shechem? Do you know where Shechem is? Shechem was a little bit north of Jerusalem. At the time of their burial, at the time Joseph and his brothers would have been buried there, it was within the borders of the United Kingdom of Israel. There was only one Israel. All 12 tribes were together at that time, as was in the days of Saul and David and Solomon. But at the time of Stephen, where was Shechem? It was in Samaria. It wasn't part of Israel. they were buried in a land that the Jews considered to be dogs. And, they wouldn't even enter into Samaria. And yet this is where their fathers lay buried. So was he laying the groundwork that if their fathers, the sons of Jacob, could be buried in Samaria, maybe it was also going to be open for the gospel to be delivered to them? If it was good enough for their fathers, it's good enough for the message of Christ. Stephen, in his defense of the gospel, spends a great deal of time on the life of Moses, and I guess why not? A very important individual. In Acts 6:11, much of the charges against Stephen was about blaspheming Moses and God. Verse 11, then they secretly instigated men who said, we have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God. So it is no surprise that Stephen spends time talking about Moses here. Stephen talks about life for the Hebrews living in Egypt under a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. Life was hard for the Hebrews. So Stephen talked about Moses as an infant being set outside and being found and taken in by Pharaoh's daughter. Acts 7:22 gives us information that isn't found in Exodus. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. Stephen had been charged with blaspheming Moses. Does this sound like blasphemy to you? It sounds like Stephen had the utmost respect for Moses. In his discourse, Stephen continues telling the story of Moses, how he fled to Egypt and how God instructed him to return to Egypt and to rescue his people. And so continuing, Stephen talks about the things Moses did in delivering the people out of the land of Egypt. Still, the people rejected him. Our fathers refused to obey him, but thrust him aside. And in their hearts, they turned to Egypt, saying to Aaron, make for us gods who will go before us. As for this Moses who led us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Now this would bring to mind the golden calf event, or the incident, the notorious event. But there are many other examples of the children of Israel rejecting Moses. The people had seen the miracles. The people had been released from their enslavement. They were even able to take the gold and silver and other material things from Egypt. Yet they continued to turn their hearts towards Egypt. It was a horrible mistake for the Israelites to reject God's deliverer Moses, who led them from Egyptian slavery. But that pales in comparison to those who reject God's deliverer Jesus, who alone can lead us from the slavery of sin. Stephen's account of the Jewish history ends with him declaring that just as their fathers had rejected Moses, he accused the Jewish leaders of rejecting Jesus. It was at that point they said, enough of this, and they stoned him to death. Saul of Tarsus, who later became the Apostle Paul, was there that day. Do you ever wonder how many times those words of Stephen replayed themselves in the mind of Paul? Could he recall Stephen saying, you rejected Moses just like you rejected Jesus? I can't imagine the weight that he carried with him, at the same time knowing that weight had been lifted when he was baptized in the Christ. But we do carry baggage with us. In Acts 13, 17, and 18, Paul briefly cites Egypt in declaring the gospel to the Jews. In the Jewish synagogue of Antioch of Pisidia, he gave a brief sermon on Jewish history, but it's more brief than Stephen's discourse. It says, the God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in the land of Egypt. And with uplifted arm, he led them out of it. and for about 40 years he put up with them in the wilderness. Paul, like Stephen, was trying to get his audience to see that Jesus is our deliverer today, and he is the one and the only one who can save us from our sins. I want to go to the book of Hebrews chapter 8, and the writer of the book of Hebrews mentions Egypt in a familiar passage. For he finds fault with them when he says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law on their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." God took the children of Israel by the hand and led them out of Egypt. The Israelites did not have the power to leave Egypt on their own. If it hadn't been for God, they may have still been in Egypt making mud bricks. They had to have someone lead them out. In Hebrews chapter 11, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses are all mentioned as being heroes of faith. The Hebrew writer spends more time talking about Moses, and it is an intriguing passage. So let's look at Hebrews 11, 23 through 29. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. In verse 23, it opens with, by faith Moses. But in verse 23, it wasn't Moses that had the faith, it was his parents, Jochebed and Amram, his mother and father. Moses would have been too young as an infant to have had faith. His parents were the ones who had faith in God to protect Moses from Pharaoh, who directed all the Hebrew babies to be killed. Moses' parents knew how precious life is and that it must be protected. They trusted God more than they feared Pharaoh. In verse 24, it starts again by stating, by faith Moses. This time Moses would have been old enough to have had a faith of his own. There is some speculation that had Moses not aligned with the children of Israel, he would have eventually become Pharaoh himself, because he was raised and adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh. He would have been trained in the Egyptian ways. He was educated in Egyptian schools. He assimilated into Egyptian society. In all essence, Moses would have been considered an Egyptian. But however, Moses looked at the big picture. He saw that the riches of Egypt and the pleasures of sin were short-term gains. Moses looked for the eternal reward that was his if he chose to follow God and trust in him. King Tutankhamun, and I know I slaughtered his name, but we know him as King Tut. That's a lot easier to say. He died at a young age of 18 or 19. Do you know why people seem to remember him more than any other pharaoh? Other than it's easy to say King Tut.
His tomb was basically intact, so they could see what a poor pharaoh's riches was compared to the great pharaohs.
Yeah, even the treasures found in King Tut's tomb were massive. There was gold galore in there. King Tut died being remembered for his riches. Those riches mean nothing to him now. Today they're shown in exhibits around the world. Some of you may have gone and seen a King Tut exhibit. Moses, on the other hand, is known for his faith, a faith that continues to reward him, a faith that will provide him eternal life. Interestingly, Moses and King Tut may have only lived 100 years apart. All right, we're going to have to end up. I didn't get to Apollos. If you remember Apollos, the evangelist, he's from Alexandria, Egypt, and became a great minister of the gospel. And then when there were two other little short passages regarding Paul when he was making his way from Judea to Rome. He gets on a couple of Egyptian ships, not cruise ships, Paul, but Egyptian ships. And they probably were going from Alexandria to Rome. And so Paul's Roman guard got him on board, and away they went. Thank you for being a part of this class. And anyway, next week, I think Justin will be here on Sunday evenings, and I forget what his class is, but anyway, Justin will be in the auditorium this next quarter, so I hope you'll come back for that.